The new book ends with a reading of Jeff Wall's remarkable photograph. Yesterday, with with the students, you were saying that in the case of the novels, you knew roughly where to begin, where to end, and you knew specifically the language you would use to end the novel. I wonder if, when you started, I wonder if you felt the same way about this book. Did the Jeff Wall photograph strike you as the way to end, or did you discover it along the way?
I discovered it along the way. I find essays, and this book is a long essay. It's not a book in the big sense. It's about 100 pages. It's a form, a nonfiction form that I like very much. The essay form, not the big book with a lot of chapters. When I write essays, I'm much more at sea than when I write novels. When I write novels or stories, I really do know the story before I start it, or I think I know it, and it's always pretty much worked out that way. At least for the ones that I've been able to finish. There have also been some fiction projects that I've abandoned because I did get lost and didn't know how to keep going in a way that I liked. But generally, I do have, as you said, I do have, as I said yesterday, the structure and the story, and sometimes even the first and last sentence before I ever start, though I don't know necessarily who's saying these sentences and what they actually mean, but they just come in a kind of trance state. With essays, it's all harder and more nebulous at the beginning. I know there's something that concerns me or obsesses me that I think about all the time, and then the writing of the essay is a way of finding out what I think. So I don't know how it goes, and usually there's a lot more rewriting of the essays than the fiction. In this particular case of the little book called Regarding the Pain of Others, it actually began, unlike most everything else I've written, as an invitation. I was invited in February 2001 to give a lecture at Oxford University in England in a series called the Amnesty Lectures. And this is a series of lectures whose the proceeds of which go to Amnesty International. In other words, it's a philanthropic situation, and they invite a couple of people a year to give lectures in this series, with the understanding that it has to be something to do with human rights or war and peace or justice or whatever. And they don't pay you, of course. In fact, they don't even want to pay your fare. They hope you'll come on your own with your frequent flyer miles, because it's all supposed to go to Amnesty. I'm a kind of a sucker for those pro bono things. As soon as I hear I'm not going to be paid, there's a little thing that says, do it, which is very perverse in capitalist America, but there it is. So I tried to think about what I could do. I wanted to accept the invitation. I thought, what could I do? And then I thought that I might write about thinking of Amnesty and thinking of this great organization that helps people, that brings aid to people who are persecuted, imprisoned, and under despotic regimes, of which there are a great many. I was thinking, well, I'm going to Oxford University, which is one of the great privileged places in the world. This is another one. And I'm going to be talking to people who are full of goodwill and good intentions, but they actually, of course, they're not the people who are the beneficiaries of this philanthropic. They're the givers of aid. They're not the recipients of aid. And there's a huge gap between the conquered and the conquerors, and between the people who are really suffering in this world, or majority, and the people who feel impelled by conscience to not as many as there should be of those people, to reach out and offer aid or express their desire to do something in the form of associations and organizations in which they participate, because it can't be just a one-on-one thing. To be effective, it almost always has to be mediated through an organization. And so that difference between what you imagine and what's really out there, with your sympathy and the actual suffering and pain of others and distress, and I thought that might be, just the very circumstances, in other words, of giving this lecture about this subject became, in fact, the origin of the subject itself. And I thought, what does it mean to think about the pain of other people? What does it mean to think about disasters that are out there, they're not your disasters, and they're taking place in some faraway country, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, disaster land, as it were, which is most of the world, most of the population of the world, whereas we live in the rich part of the world, the privileged part of the world, Western Europe and North America. And so it began that way, but it didn't have the beginning and it didn't have the end. It didn't start with Virginia Woolf and it didn't end with Jeff Wall. And it was just the very first sketch. And then I thought, oh, it's worth turning. It was the written lecture was about 30 pages. And then I thought, well, I could do something with this. I didn't know how long it was going to be, how long it would take. And then it was another year and a half almost. And in that year and a half, of course, 6 months later, I gave the Oxford lecture in February, late February, the end of February 2001. Then came September 11th later that year. And of course, that was a lot of thinking about what images of catastrophe were and how you connected with a catastrophe, how you connected with the sufferings of others. By a weird turn of events, of fate, actually, I live in Manhattan most of the time, though I spend a lot of time abroad, but most of the time, well, that's where my books are anyway, that's where my apartment is, in Manhattan. And I can see, I'm on the top floor of a building in what I call the Lower West Side, other people call Chelsea. And I'm on the top floor of a tall apartment building, and I can't see the World Trade Center. I couldn't see the World Trade Center from my windows, but the roof, which is just over my head, and to which I have access, everyone in the building has access to it. You have a clear shot all the way downtown Manhattan. So I could have seen the whole thing from my apartment. But unfortunately, and I do mean unfortunately, and yet maybe there was an advantage to it, I was in Berlin when it happened. So like most people in the world, like practically everybody in the world, I was watching it on television. And that provided another spin on my theme, because I thought, what would I have felt and thought had I been there watching it from my roof and then trying to get downtown and do things and help? A lot of friends of mine immediately went downtown and tried to help and worked in the next couple of weeks with the people who were looking for bodies and taking care of the site and excavating it and so on. And I'm sure I would have been drawn to join them. But I wasn't. I was a spectator, like most people. And that, of course, was a different experience from actually being there. So series of experiences, layers of experiences went into this. And then I was trying to think, at the end, through the problem, are there images that actually turn you against war? Right. Is it actually true that you can become an anti-war person, not necessarily a pacifist? I want to make that distinction. I consider myself an anti-war person, but I'm not a pacifist. I do think that in some circumstances, a very small number of circumstances, there is a justification for military action. But by and large, I think most of the times that military action takes place, it's completely unjustified and wrong. So let's say the non-pure position of being totally against war, which I think is completely unrealistic, but the position that most wars, certainly which are fought, are unnecessary and criminal. Are there images which would lead you to feel that and to feel that very strongly? Could you be, as it were, converted to that position by things that you see, or things that you hear, or things that you understand? And I came to think that the only way in which we're actually persuaded in a way that sticks is by narration, is by things that narrate, that it's never an image alone, it's a narration. In other words, I can see becoming really turned against war, if not talking about the real experience, but through its representation, by a movie or a book, or something that takes place in time that has a narrative structure, but not by an image itself. Because I think an image itself you can react so many different ways to it. And the coverage of the war in Iraq, or war on Iraq, as I prefer to say, is a perfect example of that. I just came back from Paris, and I saw the French coverage of the war, like practically everywhere else in the world, to be truthful, including England, the 51st state. Is pretty anti-war, and certainly the majority of people were against the war and still are. And you see these images and you think, oh, well, of course that must be reinforcing people's dislike of the war and feeling that it was unnecessary, absolutely unnecessary, and that the motives behind it are extremely suspect, to say the least, which is my position. So, for instance, I saw on the front page of a French newspaper a picture of a great burly American soldier kitted out with about 70 pounds of all that equipment, including great gloves that looked like sort of Darth Vader gloves, pinioning an Iraqi man to his knees, and just towering above him and twice his weight and strength, obviously. And the idea was, in the context of the French paper, this is an example of American power. America, a country that has 290 million people, Iraq, a country that has 24 million people, half of whom are under the age of 18, a pathetic country, a country with undoubtedly fiendish, wicked leader, but a pygmy country in terms of power, military prowess, and every other index. I mean, my own view is the reason Iraq was attacked was not because it menaces us, but because it's the weakest state in the Middle East and the easiest to overthrow and take over. Anyway, there was this image, and I thought, well, that must really be turning people off the war and making them feel that America is a giant bully embarked on a totally new program of imperial conquest. But then I saw a similar image here in a newspaper, and I realized that it's not true that the image just speaks for itself, because in the context here, that image is, look, an American soldier is subduing a looter, somebody who is up to mischief, right, and restoring order, and that's a good thing. Right. So I don't think images speak for themselves. I think they never come naked into the world. They always have a context, a surround, and they can be read in diametrically opposite ways. Then it came to me as a kind of, and it was rather late in the writing, that maybe the only image that could unequivocally, unambiguously convey on the image of war, that unequivocally and unambiguously could convey an anti-war message, would be one that was theatrical, non-realistic, staged. Right. And then I remembered this extraordinary Jeff Wall photograph, which is here in the Philadelphia Museum, and I'm going to pop in and see it again, having lived with it for months in various reproductions, all over the room where I work. I think I want to take a look at it again. I have seen it, of course. The full thing, it's huge. It's like almost the length of that wall.
Has anybody here seen it?
Yeah, I'm sure many of you see it. And I thought, well, that he built that in his studio, and those are actors. Those are actors. Those are extras, as it were. And he did it digitally, which is interesting. I didn't mention that in my description of it at the end. I mean, he did parts, and then he put it all together. It's a great, great sort of tableau. And it's completely invented, obviously. It's called Dead Troops Talk. Well, dead troops don't talk by definition. It's soldiers who've been killed in an ambush in Afghanistan. An event made up, although there must have been countless events like that. It doesn't refer to any particular event, which I thought at the beginning. I somehow assumed that it did refer to a particular ambush that he read about in the newspapers. Jeff Wall is Canadian. I don't know him. I've never met him, never been in any contact with him. He lives in Vancouver, and he's certainly never been to Afghanistan. And I just assumed that it was inspired by something he read in the paper. Then when the New Yorker magazine published an abridgment, a kind of digest of the little book in last December, about 5 months ago, it just came out last month. The indefatigable New Yorker fact checkers, to my great embarrassment, called Jeff Wall and said, "We're the New Yorker fact checkers. Was this based on where we're publishing something by Susan Sontag, but she's talking about your photograph, we're going to reproduce it in our magazine. Was this based on a real incident? He said, no, it wasn't. So I was very glad that little error was corrected. It's just a synthetic incident. It's an extraordinary picture, and I'm planning to take a look at it this afternoon.
That's great. Thank you very much. I want to switch to a question about literature and reading. You wrote somewhere in one of the essays that's collected in Where the Stress Falls that losing yourself in a book is not a fantasy thing. It's an addictive model reality. The distinction you make. And yesterday you spoke about losing yourself in books and in part teaching students to love reading. And what did you mean by the addictive model reality, and how is that distinct from the fantasy?
Well, how to justify all that? I mean, losing yourself in a book, that's of course just a cliche, isn't it? Mm. But I think there's some truth in it, and a truth that I find attractive. I think, how can I say, egocentricity is a very limited way of living your life. I mean, putting yourself in the middle of your life and always thinking about yourself. I know it seems to come very naturally to people, and if you spend time, as I have, and most of you I'm sure have, around very small children, you certainly see that being egocentric seems to come pretty easily to human beings. Maybe that's in fact the way they start. But there are other things even in the smallest child. I mean, there is the desire to merge, to submerge, to be taken over. I mean, then prototypically in the bond with the mother. So to not separate and that not be simply a self. I mean, you can say it begins with not wanting to be a self, and then it quickly the self, the I, me starts. And then where do we go? It seems that for the rest of our lives, past those very early years, the way we think about ourselves is very inflected culturally. We live in a culture in which selfishness is highly valued and praised and encouraged. It's called individualism. And you're supposed to, you're thought to be a chump, or, kind of dope if you actually put other people's interests ahead of your own, or some larger notion of the community or whatever. Of course, there are notions of sacrifice, but still, they turn around. I think only patriotism, actually, which is I think the least attractive way of not being egocentric I can think of. Only patriotism in our society competes with an idea that you should always put number one first, and then those people around you, perhaps your most immediate family, because that's in a way just an extension of you. As I say, the cult of individualism is in large part a disguise, a mask for simply the cult of selfishness. And it saturates all our ways of being and taking things in and valuing things and liking things and feeling inspired or nourished by things. And one of the things I like about reading is I do think you forget yourself. It's that kind of, maybe partly because it's something you have to do on your own. That you cut yourself off from other people. You curl up with a book. You have to go off someplace. For that moment, you are not, you are alone. Now that's private reading, of course, and I don't want to minimize the other kind of reading, which I like very, very much. I love to be read to, and I like to read aloud, and to other people. And I think that you get a lot out of that, and get a lot out of the words itself. I recently had the experience, and I was telling some people this yesterday, of reading Mrs. Dalloway aloud It's a book I love very much, and I've read quite a few times in my life. It's certainly one of my favorite 20th century novels, and I read it first as a book assigned in school when I was at college, when I was 16 or 17, and then I've read it, I don't know, every 5 years, 7 years, whatever, all my life. But recently last summer, I was spending about 10 days in a friend's country house, and people asked me the first night if I would read, because I know I like to read, and I read pretty well. And I decided to read Mrs. Dalloway, and I did it in about 8 evenings. It didn't take that long. It took about an hour, you know. It takes about 8 hours or something like that to read. And I never loved it so much as actually getting the words out of my mouth, and you know, being in it, because a lot of us, we read too fast, of course, and that's in a way a normal way to read. And a couple of people in this group, there were about 7 people in this house. A couple of those people had already read the novel. It wasn't that it was new to them, and they also felt it was thrilling to hear. So I don't want to just exclude that wonderful thing of reading aloud, but I think of reading as a promoter of inwardness, and I think that that's one of the deep functions of the arts, that it encourages us to have an inner life, or it strengthens the possibility of having an inner life. I don't know how to say it better. Inner life, inwardness, interiority, something like that. Now you might say, oh, we all have an inner life, but hey, you know, it gets pretty thin if you don't nourish it. I mean, mostly the inner life is, oh my God, I'm late, and you know, I didn't, what, and why did this person say this to me, and am I going to get fired, and I remember this, and no, I miss so and so who's dead, and you know, what do we have for dinner, and gosh, I have a hole in my sock, and and you know, and worries about the job and the family, and I mean, you know, worries, inner worries, anxieties. Most of, you know, our inner life after a certain moment is mostly a lot of worries. A lot of worries about keeping up and being up to the demands made on us. And this is perfectly normal, but this is life too. I mean, I have the same, obviously, the same level of whatever that everybody else has. If you have a life, then you worry that you're adequate to it and that you can keep up to it and that you haven't misplaced things, lost things, failed to shop for things, forgot to turn off the gas or lock the door or take the car in to be fixed or something. That if you don't do more than that, then, you know, and then worrying about, I don't know, whether Jennifer Lopez is going to get, you know, a starring role in the next movie, or she isn't, or she's going to be beat out by somebody else. That's pretty much what your inner life devolves in if you're not nourishing it. It really has to be nourished. That you might say that our culture is a conspiracy to deprive us of an inner life. And then there's the reading, and it's of course not the only thing, it's a kind of counterforce. So I guess that's what I think of as, you know, a model reality. It's a reality of inwardness. Virginia Woolf said, and I think I'd quote this, that she thought heaven might be just one uninterrupted spell of reading. Now, of course, when you're reading, you're not you. I mean, if you're really reading, you're not saying all the time, stopping and saying, is this character like me? Or what would I do in this person's place? Or you just giving yourself over. It's surrender, but it's surrender to things that are bigger than you, assuming then, you know, you're reading good books, but then why would you want to waste your time reading any other kind of books?
That's great, thank you. I think we'll take some questions from the folks here, Courtney, and also I'd like to take a moment to remind those watching by webcast that they're invited to call 215-573-9742, or to email wh@english.upenn.edu, and Tom will relay the questions. Courtney, there's a question right back here. It's Jerry George.
Hi, I have a question about your comment about where your books are that really is significant to me. You said they're in New York. You travel and you live abroad at times. 2 questions. How would you say your own personal library enriches your either fiction or essays? And do you find yourself less able to write in your usual habits if you're in Paris, for example?
Well, sometimes the books just feel like thousands of friends And the very fact that they're there, I mean, it is a kind of mania, this accumulation. I'm an accumulator. That's, as I said yesterday in another context, it's very different from being a collector. I mean, I also buy CDs, you know, and I also buy DVDs, and that's about it. Those are my three vices. But what does it mean? You know, obviously I can't be reading all the books all the time, but the function of having them is to reread them. I'm a big believer in rereading. And then sometimes, because I have read some of all the books I own and all of quite a few of them, then I just stand in front of the shelves and I look at them and I dream about what's in them. I remember what's in them. They're kind of map, you see. They're a map of the world. And since I buy books in a lot of different fields, I buy a lot of art history, for instance. I buy a lot of history, period. I have a huge number of books of art history and political history. I look at, you know, I say, well, I have 19 books on the French Revolution, and then I just stand there and I stare at the books and I start thinking about the French Revolution. You know, well, then I might take them down, but you know, the French Revolution then comes after other stuff, and they're more or less the way. I'll tell you, it's very important to me because it is a map of the world, the library. It's very important to me how they're arranged. So, as far as I'm concerned, there is no interest in having books, arranging books. You have to arrange them some way if you have a lot, to do it alphabetically. That makes no sense. I arrange my books chronologically. So it's a kind of river. You know, if I start with Giotto, let's say, you know, and I end with, I don't know, I end some Kiefer or something like that. I mean, I've actually, as I go look along the shelves, I see Western painting. Or if I start with, you know, Piers Plowman, you know, English literature, and then way down there is, well, whatever, who would be the last person in English literature, you know, so, Bruce Chatwin or something like that, then I'm saying, well, that's English literature. So I'm seeing it as, and then you get these clusters, you know, there's Wordsworth, and there's Coleridge, and there's Keats and Shelley and Byron, and you kind of live it through even as you see it. So it does function visually as a map. What is it to live without the books? I guess an incentive for going abroad is the books aren't there. Of course, one has to stay away from the bookstores abroad. Otherwise, you're coming back with your suitcase full of them. But basically, when I'm abroad, of course, I am living without books. Except, well, of course, I have 4 or 5 books that I take along a book, you know, to reread. Whenever I travel, I take at least one major book that I want to reread and a couple of things that I've just bought. Is it easier to work with the books or without the books? The books are both an incredible stimulation and always, and you know, more than what any of them say, they just remind you of a certain level, you know, a higher level. At a certain moment, you have to cut free. You have to cut free. You have to put yourself really or literally, really or metaphorically, as it were, in an empty room, and just start to do the work yourself. When I have written things that demand looking stuff up, and that happens a lot, I always try to start without looking it up. In other words, I never do a lot of preparation, because then I feel I'd be lost. I'd never know when I should stop. So what I do is I just start, and then maybe an hour a day I kind of look things up as I go along, and then I check a lot at the end. But I have to begin without looking. Otherwise, I would be. I like to study too much. The truth is that the thing I most enjoy is learning things, not writing at all. So what I really feel sometimes that what I really would just like to do is read, go to the movies, listen to music, all those things, be with people. And then once in a while, when you feel so guilty, then you write.
Courtney, we have a question up here. Jennifer.
Okay.
Okay. I wanted to kind of bring the first 2 questions that Al asked and your answers to them sort of together, if that's even possible, to kind of put photographs and your work about the war, war photographs in your most recent book, and then your novels, or the act of reading novels. But when you said see. You were talking about conversion and persuasion that sticks, which would require narration, which an image cannot do, right, on its own. And I was wondering if you could tie that together, or if it does fit together with then what you were talking about when you were talking about reading as a promoter of inwardness and interiority, and promoting one's inner life. And does that have something to do? With does that have something to do with that kind of persuasion or conversion? I hope that question makes sense.
Well, what makes sense is that you've perfectly understood what I've been saying. That's already a lot. It's one of the things I have to say that's happening here, which is really weird. This isn't the first time I've done this kind of situation, but I think I've never been in a place where I felt, where there were so many smart questions and so many people that I just felt, maybe it's your work all these months.
How about that?
Who really, I feel, well, we're in the right place. We're in the same zone together, and so I'm very grateful for that. I guess I don't know how to answer those questions directly. I'm just, as I say, so pleased and touched that you are touching the heart of my concern, because I'm very drawn to the ways in which the arts transform us, or have the potentiality of transforming us and deepening us. Now, you could say that lots of other experiences could do that too, but then what instrument of consciousness do we bring to that experience? Let me take digress as usual, and take a completely different kind of experience, the experience of being extremely ill, and thinking or being told that you're not going to make it, that you're going to die, and then you don't. You are cured. You would think that this is a very deepening experience, that it would mark you forever, and that in some way it would, how can I say, improve you, as well as perhaps diminish you, because to experience great terror and anguish does leave scars, even if you escape. I mean, when I think of just to take the most recent example, and the one that's most vivid to all of us because it is just happening or just stopping, all the civilians in Iraq who underwent American bombardment. I mean, forgetting the thousands, maybe as many as 10,000 who actually were killed. What about those who actually endured the bombardment, including, above all, children, and those who were not injured and will go on and have their lives? They're still wounded psychically. It's very wounding to be in a state of acute terror. You don't ever completely recover from it. And yet, leaving that example aside and going back to the illness example, you could say that when you are very ill and you go through this very difficult time, and then despite the pessimism of your doctors, as it were, you recover, that should be a deepening and improving experience, that it should make you more grateful to be alive, that it should reorder your priorities and make you appreciate more things that are really important, and be more resistant to trivial or trivializing experiences. Well, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, you see, because it's the instrument, it's you experiencing this. I mean, obviously, I speak of my own experience here. I mean, I had such an experience of being very ill and being told that my case was hopeless. And I think for me, it was a deepening experience, an improving experience. I think I became a better person. But what do I mean by a better person? I mean a person more responsive to others, more feeling, more open, more expressive. Sadder too, of course. I mean, you can't get past that. but if it was that the case, then I feel it also had to do with what I think of as these models of reaction or responsiveness that are represented for me in the arts, that I think of as a constant, irreplaceable nourishment. That if I'm not at all sure that if I had not, I don't know, listened to Beethoven quartets and read Dostoevsky and, well, you can fill in the rest of the list, that I would be as responsive, that I would understand how to formulate for myself, let's say, certain goals or standards of behavior that I don't necessarily feel I embody, but at least I'm proud of the fact that I aspire to them, or that they remain a standard for me. I mean, my whole idea of having standards is that they should always be higher than anything that I could achieve. That's the interest. It's not that you have the standards that you know you meet perfectly. I mean, if my standard were to be a very good speller, well, I am a very good speller. So what? That's not a standard. That just happens to be, I was always a good speller. I was kind of a kid who won, spelling bees when I was in elementary school. It's not a standard. It's just an aptitude. So the whole point of having standards, of course, are the things that you don't do, that are beyond you, or you can just sort of start in the road to achieving them, and so I measure the arts a lot by that criterion. Having said that, though, I have to say, though I'm such an upfront, out in the open moralist, I am a closet hedonist. I mean, I do really respect, maybe because I am such a moralist deep down, and that's the biggest thing. I do respect the search for pleasure as such. And because I don't think it's to be taken for granted, and just the sheer pleasure that the arts give, the pleasure of color, for instance, and the education of the eye, actually to see, the education of the ear, those things I don't know how to quite to factor them in, but I think of the arts as being that thing that really keeps you alive, keeps you going, keeps you growing, as opposed to, it seems particularly important after you're very young, because I mean the whole vector of human life, of growing up, let's say, should keep you full of juice at least until your early mid-20s, without a great deal of effort. Although you're probably imbibing a lot of terrible values, at least you are curious and alive and appetitive. And then when you get into your routines of job and family and obligations and so on, it starts going in the other direction. And it's all about maintenance and trying to keep things from getting worse. And after you bought the first house and got your mortgage and done this and done that and done the other, and then where are you? And then it seems all those other things become even more important. How to actually stay as alive and as responsive as a child. I mean, children are the most wonderful model. Talk about models. A 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, that's really a model for being alive. All those questions that children ask, and the way they look and the way they respond to everything. I mean, without being sentimental about childhood, I do think that it's very important to keep the child in that sense, not in the sense of immaturity and not in the sense of vanity or egotism, but in the sense of responsiveness, to keep the child alive. And how do you keep the child alive? It's hard to keep the child alive. So culture tells you to be cynical, to be a wise guy, to laugh whenever you're moved or whenever anything is serious. We're getting some talk here. Okay. I didn't really answer you, but that's some of the thoughts that your very good questions aroused in me.
Thank you. I'd like to go to the phone call, or whoever that is, and then to Blake in the back. Tom?
The phone call is from it's from Charles Bernstein, who's calling from the Upper West Side in New York City today.
Great. Bring him up, Bill, please. Charles, can you hear me?
Yes.
Bring him up a little higher, Bill. Charles, can you try it again?
Yes, I can hear you.
We can barely hear you.
Okay, how about this? I'll talk really loud.
You should be able to hear Susan when her answer when you ask your question. Hi, Charles.
Hi. Should I ask my question now?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was interested in your approach to the essay and the art of the essay, which seems so much a part of your work, and yet in a certain way always underestimated and under-recognized within our own U.S. culture. So I had two related questions, one of which is, who do you feel are for you your great contemporary companions in the art of the essay, people writing now or in the last 25 years who inspire you or who you feel some connection with in terms of the particular work they do in the essay? And the other question has to do with the state of the publishing of the essay, where the publications with wide and mass circulation seem to shrink away from the kind of complexity of essays that your work represents. And where do you think essays are thriving today in the U.S. publication scene?
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks for the question. Well, I'll do the second question first, if I may. The question of how do you get the essays published. I think it's a great period for the essay. In terms of outlets, I have actually, Charles, I have just the opposite impression. I think people are more interested in essays than they are in fiction. Magazines, anyway. The New Yorker, for instance, which is obviously a preeminent place to publish anything in the old days, and that's not so long ago, used to publish 2 stories every issue, and then other material of, an essay or essayistic kind. Now they publish at most 1 story an issue, and some issues have no stories at all. The New York Times book review, the weekly book review, will put nonfiction first in the table of contents and fiction after. There are hundreds of magazines in this country, ranging from the famous ones like the New Yorker, the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, all the quarterlies, some excellent quarterlies like Salmagundi, many others that I can mention, that publish a lot of essays. I don't actually feel that the essay doesn't find outlet. What is true is that books of essays perhaps don't do so well as other kinds of writing, but I actually don't have the impression that essays are in any way an endangered literary form, and I think it has quite a lot of outlets. I mean, I read essays all the time. I also read a lot of academic essays in various magazines like Representations and the Yale Review and so on. And I think that I feel very instructed by those essays in art magazines, Art in America and so on. The essays that appear in the guise of book reviews in the New York Review of Books, New Republic, Nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think it's actually, in my view, a flourishing form. As for the essayists who have mattered to me, well, the ones that I learn from tend to be more academic. I'm not so interested in the personal or memoiristic essays. I'm interested in the ones that I can learn from. And I read an awful lot of stuff published by university presses. In terms of my own writing, the models that I acquired, I have to say I read these people after I started writing essays, but so they were kind of retroactive influences, but people, the obvious names like Walter Benjamin and Roland Barthes, and the early essays of Adorno, the essays of Valery, the essays of Jacques Rivière. And again, a great, great, great model for me, and one of my favorite writers, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So I think this is a great form. I'm been very fortunate in that I have published quite a few books of essays, and some of those books are, well, one of the books is almost 40 years old, and they're all still in print. That's an unusual destiny for an essay writer. I can only justify it by saying that maybe I work harder than anybody else. I've spent as long as a year on an essay. And I mean a year. I mean a year of working almost every day on something that ended up being 25 or 30 pages. Most people don't want to do that put that much into an essay. And maybe I'm crazy to have done it myself, but if they have lasted, maybe it's just because I worked so hard on them.
Thank you, and thank you, Charles. Blake has a question from way back there.
Good morning.
Whoop.
He
Can't
blew it
hear.
out. You talked too loud.
Sorry, can't hear you.
Come
bud.
into Tom's spot and use the mic there, Blake.
Hello?
There he is. He's back.
Okay. I'll speak softly. I'm wondering, Susan, I'm standing here and you seem to have so much to impart, and in many ways you're taking a didactic role and you're being very much a teacher. How come in your own career path did you deliberately choose an unacademic career?
Because I think I'm too obsessional and by temperament, and I think that teaching is a full-time job. I know that lots of very good American writers have been teachers. One example that comes to mind, I probably should have mentioned it before in answer to Charles Bernstein's question about essay writers. I didn't give any contemporary examples, and the one that comes right away to mind is William Gass, who is an extraordinary essayist. He's the fanciest prose stylist around, and I think his prose style absolutely gobbles up whatever he's trying to say. But it's a terrific ride. It's a fabulous ride and a very, very, very high level. Another essayist, I'm going back to the earlier question, I'll go back to you, Blake, is that I like enormously is a writer named Elizabeth Hardwick. Hasn't written a great deal, but I'm a sucker for a fancy prose style, and both William Gass and Elizabeth Hardwick are wonderful writers. There's a younger writer whose essays I like a lot, writes a number of marvelous essays about African American literature, named Darrell Pinckney. I love his essays. A lot of them have been published in the New York Review of Books. I think this whole question of what you choose to write and where you choose to put your energies is incredibly difficult. I always have the feeling that I'm not writing the books I really want to write, that something else has come up that demands my attention, and then when I just get past this, I'll really be able to start the real work that I'm that I really want to do. So life is just consisting of just very, very long preparation to do something entirely different. I don't know, maybe that really is the case. Maybe I will turn into a completely different writer 2 or 3 years from now, and I just get all this 40-year spell of juvenilia out of the way. Blake, I've lost your question. Repeat it again. I'm sorry, I've digressed too much.
Why did you choose not to be at a university?
Why did I choose not to be in a university? Because it's a full-time job, because writing's a full-time job, because I'm obsessional, because I care too much about teaching. I think teaching is wonderful, and I did teach. But I can't imagine that I would have the possibility to work in the obsessional way that I've been describing to you if I were also teaching. And because I think teaching is not just, emitting knowledge. It's a connection with other people. It's a connection with your colleagues, with your students. It's an absolutely all-encompassing way of life. I know where I lost the track is because William Gass came into my mind, and that was the link between the previous question and this one. He's a wonderful American writer, and he's always taught. Right. He's taught in the English department mostly at the Washington University in St. Louis, and so have a lot of very good American writers mostly taught. I dare to think they would all be better writers if they weren't academics. And I'm talking about the really creative ones like Gass. I think in the end, particularly that generation, William Gass, John Hawkes, Robert Coover, these people who stayed in the university, as wonderful as their work is, I think it would have been better if they hadn't been academics. And so that was the choice I made, which was a real sacrifice, felt like a sacrifice. I always felt the university was home, and I feel like a self-defrocked academic. So I cast myself out into the wilderness of living, as a freelance writer and not making any compromises, and that wasn't easy because the obvious compromise, if you're not going to teach, is to become affiliated with a magazine, that will sustain you. And I had a number of opportunities of that kind, but I thought, I don't want any institution affiliation. I really do want to be able to spend 1 year on an essay, doing nothing else. I mean, I'm thinking the particular essay I'm thinking of is the one on Roland Barthes. It took me 1 year to write that essay, and I couldn't believe it. And I wrote it over and over and over and over and over again, and it always seemed that it was something wrong, and so I worked on it some more. Now that was from many points of view absolute folly from the point of view of paying the rent and from another point of view. But I felt no magazine was waiting for it, and I could do whatever I want. I could just write. Or not write. And I hasten to add that I don't write all the time. You can't imagine that I have all these interests and I'm also writing 10 hours a day. I'm not. I go for weeks without writing. I don't recommend this, but it's the way it is. I like to go out and play. And then I shut myself up and I do work day and night for long periods. But then I go for long periods not doing it. That rhythm of work, to be entirely available to your work, your passions, your interests, is not possible with the obligations of teaching.
We have a question here from this gentleman, Courtney.
Once you wrote Against Interpretation, and it carried too much of value as far as criticism is concerned. It had brought to the age of modernism, particularly in my literature, that is Gujarati Indian literature. But now, in the days of deconstruction and in the days of globalization, how would you like to reconsider this perspective of against interpretation? Because if we take the consideration like that, if I want to go against interpretation, it does construct a kind of perspective. So it's a kind of escapism or whatever. I would like to know from you, what's your opinion now?
Well, the essay Against Interpretation, which is almost 40 years old, I think it was written in 1964, so it really is juvenilia, is something basically, of course I wouldn't write it now in that form, but I still stand by it. I think it was a correct description of a state of affairs. I'm not against, as I think I made perfectly clear in the essay, against interpretation as such, and that would be idiotic. I mean, to quote Nietzsche, all thinking is interpretation. In the larger sense, of course, there's nothing but interpretation. When against interpretation was an argument, a very polemical argument against particular kinds of interpretation, which I thought reductive and Philistine. And I stand by the attack on those particular kinds of interpretation of literary and texts and other works of art. In a larger, more extended sense, a good deal of my work has been precisely against interpretation, by which I understand a very classical operation of demystification. For instance, the two essays which I wrote on illness, that are now joined together as if one was the sequel to the other, Illness as Metaphor and AIDS and Its Metaphors, could be described as essays against interpretation. That is to say, I am against treating illness metaphorically. I'm against associating illness with moralistic values so that you're ashamed of being ill. I'm against saying, using the names of illnesses as synonyms for evil, the way the word cancer is used as a synonym for evil. I'm saying illness is illness. It's physical. Your illness doesn't necessarily have any meaning. There is such a thing as destiny or fate. Not everything has meaning, and that's fine. In fact, it gives us more freedom. So you could say those were exercises in the strategy of against interpretation. I think of those essays as liberation texts to free patients from the extra anguish of having all of these punitive meanings attached to the situation of being ill. So when I'm against interpretation, I'm against the interpretations which are punitive, reductive, and Philistine. And I think in some respect that's, you know, part of what I do and what I have to contribute, coming out always of concrete experience, because there's no essay that I write that isn't based on concrete experience. The new book regarding the pain of others comes out of my experience of war. I have been in 3 wars, and in the third and most important of these experiences, I lived for the better part of 3 years under bombardment in a city under siege, the city of Sarajevo, between 1993, 1994, 1995. I wouldn't write about what war means and the difference between the representation of war and the reality of war if I hadn't experienced war. I wouldn't think I had any right to write about it. I wouldn't write about illness if I hadn't been ill. I've been twice a cancer patient, and I know what I'm talking about. I'm a cancer patient right now, or a recovering cancer patient. It's a second primary cancer. And I think it's very important to write from where you are and from where you know and where you have something to say, and to refuse the nonsense that people talk when they don't really know what, you know, they don't have any real experience to go on. And that was the whole idea of those essays. So I don't feel in any way it's outmoded procedure. I just don't want it to be confused with the idea that I'm against interpretation, which would be like being against thinking. I mean, that's kind of silly.
Courtney, I know we have a question for Meredith there.
I'd like to pick up on what you just mentioned about having real experience to go on. And I have 2 questions, actually. The first is about younger essayists. You mentioned Gerald Pinckney, a commentator on African American literature, and I'm wondering if there are other younger essayists who you respect or you'd recommend. And then the second part of my question is specifically for younger writers, which is, must an essay have something universal as its subject, or can pop cultural topics be as compelling as high cultural topics?
Well, in answer to the first, since I'm reading essays all the time, I can't just say, oh, there's this wonderful essayist, you know, and I can give you a name right off the bat. I mean, there are a lot of writers who write essays, and those are you know, writers I like. But it isn't like there's a separate category of the essay writers. You know, there are these volumes that come out every year: Best American Essays, Best American Stories, and so on. There aren't that many essayists who just write essays. So I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you and myself just as much, and then I'm not going to be able to come up with a name right away and say, oh, you should read. Actually, you know, the easier way for me to answer the question, not that I'm suggesting we do it because it would take too long, is if you say, on the subject of such and such or X, who do you think I should read? And then some names would come to me, because I go subject by subject rather than in the case of essays. There are particular people on particular subjects that for instance, I'll give you a name now, it does come to me out of that. Hal Foster, who's a teacher, I think he teaches in a university in upstate New York. I forget, it might be Buffalo or Schenectady, or anyway, I can't remember. Maybe it's Cornell, I don't remember. Anyway, he's somebody who I've discovered in art magazines, and he writes about architecture and design, and he's very brilliant. So for me, it's subject by subject rather than the essay form. And what was your second question?
It was about. Sorry. It was about subjects for essays.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, I remember. Well, first of all, words like universal. I think we shouldn't worry about words like that. They're just rocks in the road. I mean, don't worry about what's universal. First, everything's concrete. And so it's not about going to the universal. I don't know what the universal would be. I mean, the only thing would be universal would be mathematics or something. I mean, everything you do is concrete. Your life is concrete. Your personal circumstances are concrete. You don't speak language. In general, you speak English or whatever other languages you speak. So universality is not even at issue. It's not even a relevant category. you can write essays about anything. There's an English essay. See, now, my references are starting to flow in. There's an English writer who writes for a small circulation magazine that I like a lot called the London Review of Books. I don't know who he is, but I'm very moved to write him a fan letter. His name is Peter Campbell, and he does their covers. So first of all, he's an artist, and he has done for many years these beautiful watercolors that every issue has on the front of the magazine. It's a big magazine like that. It's bigger than I guess the New York Review of Books. I don't know what you would call that. It's not a tabloid size.
Not quite
but
tabloid, yeah.
Yeah, and this magazine has existed for about 20 years, and at least for the last 10 years, everyone has this very beautiful watercolor by Peter Campbell. And then in the inside, you'll get occasionally essays. It might be a review of a Piero della Francesca show at the National Gallery in London, or a recent article that I just thought was so fabulous. It was about escalators and the history of escalators and how difficult it is to repair an escalator. And while an escalator seems like a very simple machine, rather sort of late 19th century or early 20th, apparently it's an unbelievably subtle machine, and when an escalator breaks, you probably notice that when they do break, they don't get repaired for quite some time. Well, it apparently is awfully hard to repair an escalator, and here was this staggeringly elegant, long thing about escalators, and I just loved it, and I thought, how wonderful, you see. And maybe if I were just an essayist, my ideal would be that maybe I could write about, Piero della Francesca or Christopher Marlowe, or Emily Dickinson or something, and then next week I would be writing about escalators. Well, not the next week, given the fact that I'm so slow 4 months later or something like that. In other words, the range should be what turns you on and what's interesting. It's not about, if you're really interested in why Madonna's new album probably is going to sink like a lead balloon, and you really think you have some ideas about Madonna's latest self-reinvention, then go for it. I mean, it isn't, you can be smart and interesting and lively about anything. I mean, that's really the trick. The trick is that if you want to talk about, this, you should be able to generate some ideas, and it's the quality of attention and energy that you bring. It's not about the subject. Any subject is valid. It's what you do with it.
Thank you, Meredith. Courtney has a question up front, and then we may have just one more question.
Thank you, Susan. One brief question. You did an essay in the New Yorker, of course, that everyone has probably read after 9/11. I was wondering if you had to weather any terrible slings and arrows after that. I do remember that your name was bantered about on radio stations. How did you hold up?
Well, that was the thing I was telling you about before, that I was in Berlin rather than in my apartment, where I could have seen the whole thing and then gone down there. And an editor at the New Yorker called me, who I know socially, was a friend, and said, I'm rounding up comments. This was on September 13th, 2 days after, 48 hours after. Said, I'm rounding up comments by writers on September 11th, and I've got John Updike, and I've got this one, that one, would you want to do it? And I said, absolutely not. I don't want to do it because I'm here, not there, and I feel horrible, and I'm just sitting stunned, watching round the clock, watching CNN in my hotel room in Berlin, and I don't have anything to say. And then she just nagged me for the next hour. And I wrote something that could not in any way be dignified in the name of an essay. I wrote about 7 paragraphs about essentially how I felt this was being represented. I was sickened by the way it was already being discussed. That the forces of barbarism, had amassed and were attacking us, civilization, and it was real jihad language, and the media and the first reaction to it, and some sense of a kind of outrage that seemed to me not helpful to try to understand what actually had provoked this attack. And so I wrote something which concluded, I wrote it in 15 minutes, so you see this is the opposite of essay writing, because I would never think that I was just like talking, not like real writing. And the last line was, by all means let's mourn together, but let's not be stupid together. Well, this provoked a storm of attack of the most amazing kind. I mean, there was, in a terrible right-wing weekly that I have occasionally written for, called The New Republic, only book reviews at the back, not in the front, I mean, which is now a total pro-Bush, pro-everything magazine. There was an article the very next week that started with the sentence, "What do Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, and Susan Sontag have in common?" Yeah. And it's not that we all have brown eyes, which I guess would be the case. No, it's that we all wish the destruction of America. And the Daily News called for me to be drawn and quartered. And when I thought, well, that drawn and quartered, do they really know what drawn and quartered means? Maybe they think it means tarred and feathered or something like that. And there was a lot of other stuff. I had death threats in the mail, I hasten to add, nothing worse than that. And a lot of people, you know, and I suppose Clear Channel radio and those sorts of places, the ones that persecuted Natalie Maines, must have been on the air saying their thing. I didn't feel scared personally. Maybe I'm a little bit, I'm not so easily scared. But I was shocked because I thought it was a very bad sign for what was happening in our country. And I think all the signs have confirmed my feeling that something very radical has happened. We've had a regime change, and it's a more radical one than I think most people are prepared to think. At the height of the opposition, when it was still a really strong position to take, the opposition to the war in Vietnam, and I was a very active and visible founder of the anti-war movement in the 60s, I never felt the kind of hatred or aggressiveness that I felt in reaction to this pathetic 7 paragraphs in The New Yorker, which said, among others, there were a couple of things that it said that really ticked people off. One of them was, I said that it was absurd to hurl every possible insult and negative adjective at the terrorists, the people who had gotten in these planes and killed all these people, which obviously I think was a horrible crime. I said, for one thing, I mean, it's absurd to say that they were cowards. Well, this seemed to just infuriate people. I didn't say, I just said that you couldn't call them cowards. You couldn't call them everything, because the reason being that I don't think that bravery is a moral virtue. I think that scoundrels, terrorists, criminals can be brave. We all know that it must take some bravery to rob a bank or commit a crime. I mean, it's not a moral virtue to be brave. It's a moral virtue to be kind, but it's not a moral virtue to be brave. And read Aristotle. There are virtues which are not moral virtues. You can speak of moral courage, but you have to add the adjective. And so I thought I was just saying something kind of obvious. In fact, I didn't feel that anything I said in that little piece was radical. I hope in my lifetime I've said a few radical things. I'm not even sure of that. But I certainly don't think that that was one of them. And yet the notion, there's this sinister phrase, united we stand. You know, united we stand means shut up. It means that any dissent is unpatriotic. And I wasn't even dissenting yet. I dissented a lot more since. I was just saying, let's think, let's reflect, let's try to understand why this happened. And that was considered illegitimate and unpatriotic. And how does one weather that? Well, I think the best way, and I think it's my whole theme, is I think not to think about yourself. I don't want to think about myself. I don't want to think about what's happening in this country and whether it can be reversed. Or are we really, is this really the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire? I mean, that may be, in fact, where we are. This may be the most radical turn in American history. And we are entering a whole new era now, and it's even when this bunch of scoundrels is out of office because of the great economic problems that are coming up and so on, people will come in who will not essentially have a different foreign policy. That's my fear, that it's not just confined to Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Pearl, Wolfowitz and company, but that we really, America, the American tradition that's already represented by Theodore Roosevelt and to a certain extent by what's now called militant Wilsonianism has actually triumphed. And this country sees no reason why its largest vocation should not be to rule the world. That's a it's a plausible dream. Other countries have had it. If so, we're for living in a very different country from the one that we thought we were living in.
I'd like to ask a final question. When I was reading In America, it's a great novel, and I got to the last chapter and I was reading Edwin Booth's dramatic monologue. I was stopped in my tracks at a particular question he asked. He's been talking about Shakespeare, and he's, I guess, beating himself up about messing Shakespeare up. And then he asks, what can the paradise of words mean to us now in America? And it may be that that was just, I'm really not sure what your response to this question will be. It may be that this is just part of a monologue and he's being Edwin Booth, very manic and depressed. But I kept thinking that in a book called In America, that this was a line that I had to take very seriously as saying something about the whole book. So I really would like to ask you what you meant by the paradise of words, or at least what you meant Booth to mean. And what did you mean by his asking whether the paradise of words, I assume he was referring to Shakespeare in context, what could that mean for us now in America?
Well, I think when I was writing In America, which takes place in the 1870s and 1880s in this country, I thought that when I started to do the reading of the story that I decided to tell, I discovered an America that was completely different from the one we know. And I discovered it wasn't so different. The continuities in American culture and history are extraordinary. And already in the post-Civil War period, there was tremendous anguish. You find it in Whitman, too, about the ascendancy of commercial or mercantile values, money, in other words, culture of money, where everything is measured by the dollar sign and whether it makes money or not. That people were worried about this. They didn't. It's not so much pre-Civil War, but it starts after the Civil War. In the late 1860s, 1870s. Very, very similar preoccupations to the ones that people have had ever since. I mean, how can you preserve these traditions of excellence, or call it high culture, whatever, in a society in which money, mercantile values have been enthroned as the final arbiter of value and success. And I think I mean, my Edwin Booth is obviously partly an invention, but I don't think it's implausible for Booth for a character named Booth living in that time to have asked, what's the future of Shakespeare? And Shakespeare standing for literature, standing for a theater that is just a theater of quality, not a theater which is totally dependent on the laws of the box office. And that's a question then that every serious American person has continued to ask. There's one other exchange in the novel which I like a lot, because I think it's also about now as much as it was already about then. There is an evangelist who accosts, who sort of breaks in on the main character, who's this actress, and says, why are you on stage? Why don't you do something good with your talent? Why don't you become an evangelist? Why don't you speak words that are true instead of these fictions that you put up and put in these immoral plays? And I mean, she's very funny because, of course, there was an awful lot of Shakespeare being done at that time. More than half of all theater productions in the United States in the 1870s and 80s were Shakespeare. It was the height of bardolatry. Then the other half was a lot of schlock and melodrama and vaudeville. But it was just amazing how much Shakespeare was done. Everybody owned a copy of Shakespeare's plays and knew these plays in America. And she even starts to talk about how immoral Shakespeare is. Shakespeare is, what's a play whose title she garbles, Midsummer Night's Dream. I think she calls it Midnight's Dream, something. I forget how I did it. And she said, it's about a bunch of couples lying around, in the forest, lying on the ground together in the forest. She sees immorality everywhere. Well, we've got these people still with us. Who was it? Was it, oh God, another horror of the government, Ashforth, I guess, who, when he gave some press conference in the great hall of the Department of Justice, as this Liberty, which is, Justice, I'm sorry, which is traditionally a woman naked from the waist up, eyes bound, holding scales. Well, he had her covered up because, because that would be immoral to see a woman's breast. Yes, woman's breasts, and this conventional statue of justice.
Ashcroft,
so we still Ashcroft. It is Ashcroft. Sorry. All these things are still there, and the fight is still there. The fight. You see, it's a double-pronged fight. On the one hand, it's money, but on the other hand, it's a terrible censorious modernism that calls itself religion. And already again, Tocqueville, when he came to America in the late 1820s and wrote this greatest of books about America in 1835, how he saw this, I can't understand, but he did. He said religion, or what calls itself religion, plays a greater role in the United States than it does in Europe. Now, you think, he's writing in the 1830s. Mm. Religion, certainly from our perspective, when we look back on European history at that time, looks awfully important in Europe, and yet already he saw a role, a civic role for religion in this country, which it was not playing in Europe. And now, of course, it's inconceivable. You think back, Lincoln didn't go to church. Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't go to church. We used to be quite comfortable with presidents who didn't say that their Jesus Christ was their favorite philosopher. And now, you see, everyone has to give lip service to an incredibly conformist and empty idea of religiosity, which by my standards has virtually nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. But it's a tremendous enforcer of conformity in this country. So it's the moralism, that kind of moralism, on the one hand, family values. I was told, and I was still in Paris until night before last, so I didn't read this myself, but I was told that the Secretary of Education, in a recent press conference, I'm talking about the Secretary of Education in this country, said that he would send his children to Christian schools if he had small children rather than to public schools, because in the Christian schools he would get good values. Now, excuse me, whatever happened to the separation of church and state? Since when does a minister of education, a secretary of education, support publicly the religious schools as a preferable alternative to the public school system, which is the foundation of our democracy? So all these things, I think, they were there already in the time that I wrote, the time in which I situated in America, though I didn't know it. I learned a lot writing this book. I had no idea. But what is the paradise of words? How's that going to survive? Disinterested things of integrity, things which are not measured by money, and things which are not measured by this false conformist spirit of assent to American triumphalism, which is called religion. We have now a country which has three very important fundamental beliefs that are constantly being reaffirmed. We're the exception. We're the exception to every rule. We are totally virtuous. Even when we do wrong things, they're right, because we make them. And it work out in the end. And we will always triumph. We may have to redefine what triumph or success is, but we will always triumph. That's a very heady cocktail for everybody to be swallowing, and sets people up for a different destiny for this country. I didn't think I was going to be writing really about America, even though I call the novel in America. I thought I was writing a theater novel. I thought I was writing a novel about a woman and the price of renunciation that a woman may have to pay if she wants to have a great career. And then it did turn out to be a novel about America.
And a paradise of words, I think. Susan Sontag, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Susan Sontag. Thank you all for coming. If you want to, we only have a few minutes where Susan can sign a few books and greet you, and then I'm afraid we have to stop. So I will rigorously guard the line, but please do come and say hello, and thank you again for coming to the Writers' House. If this is your first time here, please sign the book, and have a great day. Huh?